I mean, I was devoted to this notion that as a kid, all kids, you go into the closet, close the door, and instantly stuff happens. People start screaming, you see things in the dark, all this kind of stuff. And if you don't open the door, chaos ensues. And whatever story might have been going on is completely lost because there's just a lot of screaming. So the whole reshaping of the story really was to allow those oral moments and those moments in the dark, and at the same time get control back.
That is Imagineer Rick Rothschild talking about the extraterrestrial alien encounter. Let's do this. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, it's Dan Heaton. You're here for episode 142 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. It's an exciting time right now. We are rolling into June. I hope you're all doing well. It's getting hotter out. Things are opening. Avengers Campus, Velocicoaster, a lot of other things. I'm enjoying it. Haven't been to the parks for those, but I'm really excited to get back there and enjoy seeing a lot of your photos and videos and everything else from the parks. Really excited about today's show. Returning guest, Rick Rothschild, was a Disney Imagineer going back to the early days of Epcot. Last time we talked about American Adventure, Soarin', Pleasure Island, just great stuff. And I'm glad that we had the chance to dig further because he's done a lot of cool stuff in his career. I'm really interested in the era, we often call it the Disney decade, which many look at as kind of the 90s. But to me, really, it started when Michael Eisner joined the company. So you're thinking with some of the attractions that started to come out in like 1986 and everything, going all the way through basically when Disney's Animal Kingdom opened in 98. So that's a cool time, and I haven't dug into a lot of those attractions. So getting the chance here to talk with Rick about Captain EO, Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, the Alien Encounter, which I mentioned in the intro, really cool to talk about some other attractions, and even I get to learn a little bit about the transition to Stitch's Great Escape, which I have not talked to anyone about that. So that was really fun to learn more from Rick about some of the 4D experiences and then other cool attractions from around the same time. I wanted to give one clarification. There is a moment early on where Rick is talking about the team that started to develop the concepts for Captain EO. And he references Richard Vaughn and then Joe Rohde, and then there's kind of a little cut. This was one point where our sound went out for just a moment, only time on the whole podcast, but I wanted to give clarification that the other person he mentioned is Tim Kirk. So basically, with that group, he references them again later. That is Tim Kirk, who, along with Joe Rohde, Richard Vaughn, and Rick Rothschild, was starting to develop the concepts early on for Captain EO. I hope you enjoy the show. I really like talking to Rick, and he also has some interesting info at the end about technology, kind of where it's going and how that fits with theme parks. I also enjoyed that answer a lot. So let's do it. Here is Rick Rothschild. My guest today is the founder and chief creative officer at Far Out Creative Direction. He joined Walt Disney Imagineering in 1978, was the show producer on the American Adventure at Epcot Center. His long list of projects with Disney includes Soarin' over California, Captain EO, Alien Encounter, Star Tours The Adventure Continues, so much more. It is Rick Rothschild. Rick, thanks so much for returning to the podcast.
No, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here today with you.
Oh, yeah. I had a lot of fun last time when we talked about Soarin' and about Pleasure Island, and we talked about American Adventure. So it's cool to dig a little further into your career because you've worked on a lot more than just those things, and we'll still probably barely scratch the surface. I'd love to start with fitting in time. You had done American Adventure, and then a little bit after that, in the mid-'80s, you got working on the development of Captain EO, which I know started after Michael Eisner and Frank Wells arrived and the company changed so much. So I'd love to know kind of how you got involved in that and how that project started to come together.
Well, as you said, the change that came to Disney with Michael and Frank coming to the company was dramatic, to say the least, in many, many ways. And for at least the first 10 years, it was dramatically upwards. So at the beginning of that upward climb, it was really waking a sleeping giant, as they both referred to it, I think, in the early days, because there was such potential there, and they were simply recognizing the vast amount of potential there and really re-energizing the potential and re-energizing the company and the theme parks and everything that else went with it. So in those early days, I mean, they came in 85 and we started almost immediately within, it seems like maybe 6 months of them arriving, if that. They had started to look at what they could do to bring things more quickly. They'd come, one, to learn that I think doing projects at Disney, and it was constantly frustrating him. It frustrated all management forever. Probably frustrated Walt, even though things were done faster when he was around, it seems. But it took a long time to get a major project started. So one of the things they were looking at is how do we bring some energy more quickly. And so one of those was as a result of the connections and the growing connections with George Lucas, as well as previous relationships, I guess, and connections with Michael Jackson in one form or another. So Michael had reached out to Marty Sklar, who was the creative head at that time of Imagineering, and said he wanted to come over and talk about an idea he had. And I guess gave Marty enough to think about who Marty thought should be in the room to listen to what Michael had to say. So I was one of those that was asked to be in that room as a creative executive back in those days, sort of just beginning my creative executive career. So Michael said three names. He said, basically, what think about George Lucas, Michael Jackson, 3D. I'll be back in 5 days.
Wow.
Wow. Alrighty then. So a small group, it was, there were others involved as the idea actually got launched, but at its inception, the group that we pulled together was myself with Richard Vaughn, who is a designer and now lives down in New Mexico, Joe Rohde. And so the four of us basically jammed on different ideas. And those ideas the creative sessions really fostered three concepts. One of them clearly took advantage of our understanding that Michael liked the Pirates of the Caribbean. Second one, he liked Peter Pan. And the idea of mixing that with the fact that obviously we were looking for a vehicle for him to enjoy performing, not simply acting, but performing his music and dancing. And this was back in the mid 80s. So, Thriller had happened. He was very focused on choreography with large groups of dancers and all the rest of that kind of stuff. So the three ideas that ultimately popped to the surface, one was with the idea that Michael goes to the park late at night and sort of sneaks in to the Pirates of the Caribbean and has this whole adventure within the Pirates world. The second one really focused on borrowing liberally from the Ice Queen stories and the idea of a frozen world, and he re-enlivens that world. A little more Peter Pan, a little more fantasy. Both of those didn't have the George Lucas component. So I was like, okay, so yeah, there's Michael Jackson, there's 3D, and there's George. The idea of there's George being the third request. And that one netted what we call the Intergalactic Music Man, which you can tell from the story evolved into Captain EO. So 5 days later, Michael came back and said, what do you got? And we pitched the three stories with sketches that the team had done for all three of them, just to begin to give them a sense of character and Michael's character and the characters around him and that kind of stuff. And So the end result of that meeting was great. Love the intergalactic music, man. We'll get George in here and have George take a look and see what he thinks. So within a day or so, George is there, and many of us had worked with George previously in one form or another, so it wasn't like the first time we'd met him, but it was nice to see him again. And so George, we pitched the same three to him. He had obviously the same reaction, which is the one that most well suited his worlds that he'd worked in, and he thought it was a great idea as well. And it truly was the basic story that is told in Captain EO we pitched. I mean, it was evolved and so forth and so on, but it was truly a world that was physically oppressed and was rebirthed by Michael's arrival. And so a couple of days later, Michael came to WDI, and with George there, and Michael Eisner, and Jeffrey Katzenberg, I think, was there through all of this as well. We pitched to Michael. And again, we showed him all three with the notion that he probably would fancy the one that most fancied and fit with George as well, which he did, and he loved it. And I remember when I was pitching the story, one of the last, if not the last line that I used in pitching was, "You bring color to a colorless world." And as I said it, because we'd done all these black and white sketches, and then the last sketch was full of color. Right? But as I'm looking at Michael, there's this twinkle in his eye. Because there was a bit of a double entendre, I think, to what I was saying. Anyways, he loved the idea, and off we went. So that was really how the birth of the idea happened. And then the core team of Joe and Tim and Richard and myself stayed involved. I think over time, Tim probably peeled out first. Richard was doing a lot of the character design. Joe also did some character design. So things like Fuzzball is very much a Richard Vaughn character. So a lot of that work continued, along with my continuing to work as they brought the production team in, working on the overall production.
That's an interesting project, too. Like you mentioned, George Lucas and Michael and Francis Ford Coppola, which is three kind of gigantic people in terms of what they've done, and also possibly egos and just talent. So working on that, how was that with that group? I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to think about where those three were in the early 80s and mid-80s, and them all working on this theme park attraction.
And I should add, there were a few more that obviously those three brought in as a result of those three. Vittorio Storaro, who was the director of photography, who'd worked for years with Francis, and who I don't think had ever done a 3D movie. So that's a whole nother story. Then Michael was very interested in, as he was looking at costuming, John Napier, who had just, he'd done many shows, but the most recent one at that time was Starlight Express. And there was something, if you think about Starlight Express and you think about the costume that Michael wore, which John was the conceptual designer for, there was something to John's presence as well. And John has an interesting story I can tell here additionally. And so really the process of how to help everybody, because nobody really worked. I mean, I don't think George had done any 3D movies. Francis may have experimented with something long ago or not, but it was a new thing. And to shoot in 65, for 70 millimeter projection, the idea back in those days, there was no CG. So they knew it was going to be heavily effects laden, which meant a 3D hand-drawn effects process, which turned into both a nightmare and an extraordinary process that Harrison Ellenshaw was eventually brought in. Tom Smith, who had headed ILM for a number of years, was brought in. There was so much really sort of to the idea and the idea growing. But I think to answer the specifics of your question on those three, my sense was tremendous collaboration. Actually, it's very interesting. Another side note, I pulled out some sketches years ago that go back to the storyboard sketches that were done that George, who really was sort of leading the story effort. And I see in the corner, Brad Bird. And I remember at the time when we were doing this, not the name, obviously we all know the name very well now, but I remember George had said, I'm using this really amazing storyboard artist who's working with me on an Indiana Jones or something, and I've just pulled him into this because I've got him right now and he's great. So Brad Bird was involved as a young
Wow.
talent. So, and the list goes on. I mean, you can go through the choreography and the music, ancillary to Michael's music, all the rest of it. So, but back to this, there was really an energy. Generally, it was crazy, and it was under tremendous pressure to do it very quickly and pull it all together quickly, and using 3D, which was an art form, and dealing with all of that. But there was I felt a tremendous spirit of collaboration, and it was really fostered by Michael and Jeffrey as well. When it started, and I'll go back to John Napier, John was really intrigued because he came over and he wanted to understand, because he had no idea, he'd never been to Disneyland, had no idea what Disneyland was. So we were introduced to him because we were the Imagineers, and I took John first to Disneyland and spent a day with him experiencing Disneyland. And also he got quite intrigued with Imagineering, because as a designer, he was not only a costume designer, but a very well renowned, and went on to do many more set designs, and started at really his career as a sculptor, which is why his costumes are so sculptally, or sculptured in their essence, and his sets are so extraordinary. The Les Mis set with all of its movement and dimensional shapes that it could take and so forth. So he was really intrigued with Imagineering, and he was also intrigued with 3D. So it was real. And so he said, I want to spend some time. And so just sort of getting to know WDI and sort of working with the design team and so forth. And out of that energy came this idea of, how do we break the boundary of 3D beyond just what 3D can do, but how do we physically break it? So there was he had this notion of, like, could we, in graphic art, quite often, to give a sense of 3D, you'll put an inner frame, and then you'll have an object, a hand or some object that breaks the frame to give it that sense that it's coming forward. So he said, could we come up with some kind of flexible frame around the screen that could do that? And it's like, well, yeah, but no, but that's a really interesting idea that led to conversations that eventually went back to Michael and Jeffrey, and they got, along with Francis and George and Michael Jackson, of like, well, what can we do to enhance the 3D experience beyond just what's going to happen on the screen? So that led to what we all now, the world refers to as 4D. We didn't have moving seats, so we didn't have 5D yet. But that fourth dimension, that really, to me, it's just sort of adding a more enveloping, more immersive 3D experience. So out of that came what we ended up doing, including the infamous, 3D Starfield with all the fiber optics that went from 2D to 3D. And we knew that the screen was going to be there. So how do you not put a big curtain that just opens on the screen, but do something more magical? And there was a lot of those kind of things. And the whole idea of, which was as much for me, was this idea, and John, of, objects on screen emanate light. And naturally, if you're in an environment where that's really happening, that light would come out into the audience. And interestingly enough, it would hit the front of the audience, which you wouldn't really see. But we did some experiments, and it led to this whole idea of putting light on the back of the audience so that people in front of you became more connected with the motion of light and tone of light and a bunch of other stuff to just further that sense of immersive experience. So all of that kind of stuff really grew out of John Napier, who was brought as a costume designer, which is the classic Imagineering collaborative kind of idea. You throw a bunch of people in a room and you get more than you counted on. And as I say, Michael and Jeffrey were exceedingly interested in making this a extraordinary production, and they saw this as a further opportunity. And so they then went on to say, and of course, we're going to open this at Disneyland and Walt Disney World on the same day, which I think recently Disney did that again. But this was the first time, I think, ever that Disney had done two attractions that were destined to open on the same day. And quite honestly, because so much was going on, we had two teams working in both of the spaces. The production team was evolving. So things were changing, and I was doing a week in California, a week in Florida, sort of back and forth. And sometimes we'd do experimentation or discover something new that we wanted to do. We'd figure it out in Florida, and then I'd come back to California, and it's okay, now we got to implement this here too. So it was a chaotic, crazy, fun. I mean, in some ways, I came out of theater before I went to Disney. It was a lot of my background, and production in theater is, depending on overall, but once you really get started, maybe 16 weeks, 12 weeks. I mean, it's a very intense schedule to bring together. I mean, obviously a lot of planning before that and so forth. This was more like that because things were constantly going on. Things were literally changing, from what they were discovering and editing and changing, the effects that they were doing. Like I say, Harrison Ellenshaw and Tom Smith were brought in. They set up a group of over 200 people at the Tahunga facility, which was part of the Imagineering production facilities at the time. They took over a whole floor up there, and they were doing all the 3D animation, literally cell by cell. You think about that today with what we do with CG. The combination, I guess, of all of that led to a conversation I had with George. It was the last time he saw the show, sort of 2 days maybe before opening. Of course, things never go right. And so something broke. And so we're sitting in a theater at Disneyland for a while, killing time. And so I said, so George, what's this experience been like for you? And he goes, well, he said, boy, were we naive. Francis and I started off thinking, okay, we make our 90-minute, hour and 20-minute movies. We're making a 20-minute movie. So that should be about that proportional amount of effort. He said, when all is said and done, he said there are more effects in Captain EO than there were in the first Star Wars.
It's crazy to think about that, just how much was packed into that, especially today looking back. And because, now we take a lot of the CGI for granted, and that what went into that it's kind of mind-boggling to think about how much went into a show that, came back with the tribute, but wasn't intended to play nearly as long as it did, at least from what I know.
No, Michael said if we get 2 to 3 years out of this, that's what we'll be happy. And it got 8 to 9, somewhere in there, before it closed the first time. So, I mean, it was never intended to be a forever, ever at Disneyland, like some shows are hopefully intended to be. This was clearly more of the movie attitude, which is get the movie out there, let the audience enjoy it, and after a certain point, it will no longer have a life to live in the park. And they exceeded it by 3 times, I think, their expectations, maybe even 4.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, on a related note, too, since we're talking about that theater, you also worked later on Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, which I know had more innovative 4D effects at the time, which I found very entertaining. I'd love to know, too, especially given that you worked on Captain EO, going in and doing something based on a property and very different with different effects. What was that like?
It was an interesting project, and obviously I was asked to get involved because of Captain EO and my connection to 3D and the experiential theater and so forth. So I had been in concept development, doing a lot of different ideas early on with the theme park team, production team, and so forth. And before it sort of evolved into, this is the property that we should go think about working with. But there was always this idea that we kept exploring, which this naturally gave us, which was, how do we do something where the theater, Captain EO tried to take you into an environment where the theater went away, in a sense. And, even from the star field, just the darkness and the little twinkling lights and so forth, and no boundaries, no shapes. And this one was all about, what can we do where the theater is acknowledged as a theater and something happens? And so that ultimately was the one lingering piece of the early concepts that carried its way into what became Honey, I Shrunk the Audience. I give, again, tremendous credit to Randall Kleiser, the director, who came in and really embraced the whole notion of working in 3D and the idea of, the theatricality of it, because he's shooting a movie and there is a point where it actually is more of a movie, but the rest of it, he's shooting a stage play and with a lot of effects in it. And he totally embraced that. And so I guess, again, it was this combination of finding the right people to embrace the idea that we're not doing what they traditionally do, but it's borrowing very liberally from what they are experts at, and then giving them an opportunity to step into the theme park world, where I think over my years there, working with many people who were in the mainstream media, always, once they got to know Imagineering, goes, you guys have the coolest job because you never do the same thing twice. We make movies and we make new stories. So every story is different, but still got a camera, still got a second unit. It's still, I mean, there's like a lot of the same stuff. It's still fun, obviously, and we love doing it, and we make great stuff and great movies. But this idea of working in a theme park, and that's, I guess, why all of us as Imagineers really enjoyed it. It was almost a fresh start. Marty's blank piece of paper truly meant, you were launching into a whole new opportunity, a whole new territory of who you brought together, what the disciplines, what the stories, and just sort of the delivery of the experiences different each time. So.
Well, speaking of a new opportunity, something that was very different at the time, which I know a lot of theme park fans look back on like, oh man, is the ExtraTERRORestrial Alien Encounter, because it's so beloved, yet really, I mean, it played for like 8 years, if that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I would love to hear from you how that came together, because especially in the mid-90s at the Magic Kingdom, that was quite a move by Disney to put that in Tomorrowland.
Yes, it was. It sort of was the Rocky Horror Picture Show of Disneyland, I think, in some ways. Great show, right show, a lot of fun, probably the wrong park. So I was actually working on Honey, I Shrunk the Audience at Walt Disney World as the team who had been hard at work on a previous incantation of Alien Encounter had been working on it for a number of years. And I got a call from Imagineering, from I think Tom Fitzgerald or Marty or both of them, and saying, we'd like you to take a moment and go over and experience what's going on in that show that they're still in rehearsal and so forth on. And it was supposed to open. I think originally it was supposed to open even before or around the time we were opening, which was around Thanksgiving time. So anyways, I went over, took a look at it, and the next step was Michael really likes the concept, but he doesn't like the delivery. It's not working. So it wasn't 5 days, but it was basically when you get back to California, which was early December, you have until the end of the holidays. And then Michael wants to know what we should do to maybe reconceive it and deliver a more exciting show, or a show that he feels will be more successful. So again, I had that relatively short period of time, and I also was working with a group of people. That was where I got to work for the first time with Jerry Reese, who was on it as the media director, sort of, that had been ongoing, and he and I enjoyed a tremendous partnership through the process that I was involved with, and a number of the team that had been a part of that show. But you can imagine, and it was not an easy thing for a team that had been so focused and so devoted and so strongly believing in what they were doing, to find the boss didn't quite like it, but still liked the idea, the core of it. And so I was asked to come up with what do you do with it? To help that. So the net result was that we pitched to Michael in early January the rework. And many of the team stayed on and graciously and devotedly stayed on to work in the reshaping and resculpting of this idea and the show. Few left, but I pitched the show to Michael. Michael said, "Great. How quick can we do it? I want it by summer." So it was, again, a theatrical experience, I have to say, because it was like, okay, number one, we're gonna gather a core team together, and Imagineering and all that process, leave us alone, because that will do nothing to help us succeed. So allow us to pull the right people together. And Bran Farron, who had come into the company fairly recently, was intrigued with it, and through some of his people from the at that time, the R&D group. So it was a bit of R&D, some out of his group that was part of the R&D group now, but it was in New York, wasn't even out in California. A number of engineers, people in Florida, people that I engaged and brought in. So 6 months later, 5 months later, we'd birthed this new show, which was really sort of tearing it all apart, re-scripting it, using aspects of what was there, but doing a lot of new work. And I ironically, I mentioned Rocky Horror Picture Show, the British actor Tim Curry ultimately ended up, we cast him as the voice of the robot Sir. So it wasn't intended, but it's sort of ironic in a way that a little bit of Rocky Horror actually did get into our show, maybe. But you're right. It was, I was devoted to this notion that as a kid, all kids, you go into the closet, close the door, and instantly stuff happens. People start screaming. You see things in the dark, all this kind of stuff. And if you don't open the door, chaos ensues. And whatever story might have been going on is completely lost because there's just a lot of screaming. So the whole reshaping of the story really was to allow those oral moments and those moments in the dark, and at the same time get control back and let the story evolve a little bit more. And so that came with Jerry's work as well, but that brought in the live actor, which I don't think had ever been done in a theme park, where you're literally cycling a show, two theaters, and you're cycling the show every 15 minutes. So imagine what the horror. And up to that point, whenever we brought up, let's put a live actor in a show, everybody went, no. So that was a devoted group. That cast that did that role was amazing for the period of time that show ran. It was really like pushing the boundaries in the same way that I guess we had pushed the boundaries of how do you bring adult nightclub district and Disney together. And so it's pushing the edge of Disney, but not going over that too far. And I think that was the same with this one, is like, how do you push scary and still have a story, still have something that takes an audience on a journey, as opposed to what was happening in the old concept where people were really sort of losing control and they had no way to get it back. So as I said, when we started talking about this show, it really was a great show in the wrong park. If it had been in probably Studio Tour, I think it would have had longer, run. But ultimately, like we mentioned, I reworked Captain EO into Honey, I Shrunk the Audience in the same spaces in a couple of locations. After we did Alien Encounter, I was asked to go back and go, okay, now it's got to be a kindler, gentler story in the same place. And so I then had to go in and we had to figure out how to use the Stitch in there. So I think one of the other sort of side notes of my career is that I in some ways have probably replaced more shows that I created with new shows than just about any other Imagineer. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Can I ask you the challenge with taking what is designed to kind of push the edge of what Disney does with Alien Encounter, and then to bring in Stitch, and yet still a lot of the form, like what that attraction was with the audio and kind of a little bit of scare is the same. How challenging was that for you to kind of make that sort of fit within that framework?
Well, it was personally challenging to say goodbye to Alien Encounter because I thought it worked pretty well. Yeah. I guess the idea of and the fun of both of those shows, one was obviously more adult, more mature, let's say, audience, not adult, but more. It required a little bit more maturity to accept it. I remember, the operational cast was really careful about trying to, because we had a height requirement, but that height requirement could probably be filled easily by a 5-year-old. So they would see the younger ones who were clearly younger, and they would help parents. It's outside. It says, this is a scary attraction. There's loud noises. There's all this kind of stuff. And the operators did their best too, to sort of say to parents, just to remind you that this is probably on the edge of terror at Disneyland. This is at the top. Right now. So just be careful with your little ones. Do you really, absolutely just understand we don't want you, and still people would not understand. And so that was part of what ultimately, I think, because Michael loved the show. He really did. And the audience in general, I have nieces and nephews now, her a little bit younger than you, but of that same generation. And they were like, that was my favorite show at Disneyland or Walt Disney World. So there was definitely a fan base for it, but it was that it's in Tomorrowland, Disneyland. And so ultimately the operational team, I think, kept banging on it saying, come on, guys, can we do something that's a little bit more, friendly, Disneyland friendly? So that was what led to pushing it into Stitch. And so to your question of what was that like, I liked the idea of the whole machine in the same way that theaters are machines that, that give you an opportunity to stage all different kinds of things. And there was a machine here that format that I really still liked. So it was like, all right, how do you take that format, not destroy the fun of that format, but go after a different character and a slightly different story and a slightly more friendly story. And so that really became the challenge. And plus, there were a few people I worked with back then helping us do that one that we had so much fun. Again, just the group of Imagineers that were involved. Luke Mayrand, who's very well known now as an Imagineer and worked as the designer with me on that, as did a few other Imagineers that I hadn't worked with before. So it was, personally a fun experience. Plus working with Chris, who created Stitch, who did the voice, Chris Sanders. He was a ton of fun to work with, both in sort of having approval of the story and then doing the voice for us and so forth. So, there is a silver lining in everything.
That makes sense. Yeah. I'm glad to hear it was a good experience, at least in terms of the team that you work with and everything for that, even if you had to take out such a cool attraction not take out, but adjust a cool attraction with Alien Encounter. Well, speaking of making an update, I wanted to, before we finish, ask you about the updates to Star Tours, because I think what the original Star Tours was amazing, but what they've been able to do, and what the team did with the initial different ways you can go and then keep adding more, is just a really cool way to show how you can customize. Like you mentioned, the machine and customizing it. I think Star Tours The Adventure Continues is great at that. So I'd love to know kind of how that came together and developing such what seems like a complicated setup.
So that team obviously had it at its core. Tom Fitzgerald, who had been at the helm as a young Imagineer when 1986, while we were doing Captain EO, he was leading the team working with George on the first Star Tours. So Tom was at the helm creatively and conceptually on the rework. And so there was a team long before I got involved that was really conceptualizing the story ideas, the idea of the multi-scene. And when I started to get involved, it was at the point that it was becoming, how does that work? How does that work with the simulator? What kinds of things can go into the environment itself? And again, it goes all the way back to, I guess, many of us who had done the 3D kinds of experiences where, things go beyond the screen. And obviously here you're inside of a real vehicle, supposedly. And so you should have things that happen inside the vehicle. And I'd also done something inside of a vehicle with Storm Rider over at Tokyo Disney Seas as well, which had lots of things happening in it and so forth. So that's where I then sort of joined the team more at the time of helping formulate and sculpt the experience and then help lead the team in the field, putting it all together. But it really was, I think, Tom and a core team, some of whom had been involved with him all the way back on the first one, and then obviously a collection of new designers and writers that were involved.
So you mentioned Storm Rider and then just those types of effects. Technically, just given the way technology's gone, has it become a lot easier to be able to do that, or are there just new hurdles as we continue to progress? And this could be beyond just those attractions. I'm just curious in general with 3D.
Well, I would say creative ideas and creative story ideas are limitless, which is the great power of a creative mind, being able to conceive those kind of ideas. The way you realize them, in whatever art form you're doing that in, and in our case, we're talking about theme parks, technology clearly plays a huge part, hence the word Imagineering in a way. I mean, it sort of embodies that as Walt intended. And so my answer to your question, I guess, is that technology is continually aiding us, giving us the opportunity to challenge our own thinking about how to, or how we might create an experience. And if anything, the acceleration of and convergence of a variety of different kinds of technologies and technologists thinking about how to bring those things together. We obviously, I like to think, abuse technology sometimes. It wasn't necessarily intended for what we use it for. But I think that the convergence is happening at an ever more rapid rate. It's not just that things are getting, smaller, and, the power of your phone is, exponentially X amount of what it used to be for a desk calculator and all those kinds of things. It's really the convergence of and the intermingling of both the physical technologies and the soft technologies and software that have just opened up more and more opportunities and more possibilities. So, I mean, this as a simple example of that, I remember, when we were working on American Adventure, saying, wouldn't it be really cool if someday, because we had put the Idafor in, which was this big, huge projector. It was the largest projected image in the world, video image in the world, and it was $1 million. And I think the thing was like, I don't know, 20 by or 18 or 12 by 20 or something. And back in those days, like, that's just a gargantuan projected, video image. It was like, wouldn't it be really cool someday to think that all of the unsteadiness that we had to deal with that huge projected image in American Adventure, which showed itself where no matter what you tried to do with it, where you had solid sets that didn't move and you had a projector that just had the slightest bit of movement, you're going, what's going on? So I remember sitting in the theater back in those days going, this is really cool. And the projection guys had made it as steady as they could be, but thinking, but one day, oh, here we are today. And look at all of what we're doing with projection, far beyond what we were able, even close to being able to do with mechanical projection and film projection. So, to me, the opportunity is obviously boundless, and it's boundless because I think there are ways to find, in the same way we found creative solutions with the technologies we had, and we, as I say, sort of pushed to the bleeding edge of and abused those technologies where we needed to get them to try and do what we needed them to do, and we pushed them as far as they would. I think if you look at, Rise of the Galaxy or any of those kinds, Rise Resistance. That is just another example of today and the last few years, just taking all the different available tools and the creative minds, pushing them together. And where do you go with that? And so I don't see that as ever stopping. And so if anything, I think the opportunities are greater today to realize there's still boundaries, there's still limits, there's still challenges that, sort of crossing over the next threshold with. It deserves probably a whole nother discussion in regards to virtual reality, augmented reality, how all of that plays into this, because it clearly plays into it. But I also have sort of a personal belief that it's a part of the toolkit, in the same way that movies and theater are two different kinds of performance, and neither has gone away. I think the virtual reality and augmented reality is, for me at least, another part of the toolkit. I don't think it is the panacea of, we're all just going to sort of siphon down to, and I don't think most people feel that way. But sometimes you get infatuated with new technologies. And, 3D movies. We launched with Captain EO. We made a few more at Disney. There was a run of theme park 3D movies and 4D things and all the rest of that stuff. And it only goes so far. And then it's like, what else can you do? Because there's other technologies. So But it doesn't mean that 3D has completely gone away either. Now it's more like very selective. If somebody does something, I think generally they're doing something with it where it's exploring its use, perhaps because of some of the technologies that are available, but using it in a new way, in a new storytelling way. So anyways, that's my sense of how this ongoing technology and creative storytelling will continue to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to end because, like you said, that it can get there's so much there, but still it has to fit within the attraction. Well, Rick, this has been awesome once again. Thanks so much for talking with me about these attractions. You've done a lot in your career. I know there's a lot more to cover, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much and enjoyed chatting with you.
Wanted to give a big thanks to Rick for returning to the podcast and telling a lot more great stories from his career at Disney and beyond. If you'd like to check out part 1 of my conversations with Rick Rothschild, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/Rick to get direct access to episode 112, which came out last summer. It was really cool. I'd like to also give a big thanks to my latest member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon, Koalas. Thanks so much for helping to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show and would like to also become a member and get access to some really cool perks, you can learn more by going to patreon.com/tomorrowsociety. You get access to a monthly newsletter where I write an exclusive article, Tomorrow Society pin, membership card, exclusive bonus podcasts, so much more. I'd love to have you. It makes a huge difference in keeping this show going. Another cool thing that I enjoy is when I get ratings or reviews at Apple Podcasts. Their app has been a little glitchy lately, so I understand if you moved on to another app. But if you are on Apple Podcast, heck, go back there just to leave a review. It still makes a big difference. That's still where a lot of people listen to podcasts. Thanks to everyone who's already gone out and given a 5-star rating. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to get a hold of me, I love hearing what you think about these shows. Shoot me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You can follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC, Facebook, Instagram at Tomorrow Society, YouTube channel, tomorrowsociety.com/YouTube. Lots of cool stuff. It is always awesome to hear from you. And if you've got suggestions on future guests or show topics, I always love to hear them. Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey, performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I am talking with Martin Smith, the creator of incredible videos on YouTube documenting attractions from Disney all around the world. He's doing amazing work, and I really enjoyed the chance to talk with him. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I will talk to you again very soon.